fighting anti-Semitism in this moment, what it even means to do so. And it's not a topic that we've addressed here at the ACJ directly in this way. So I'm really excited to get into it with these two folks that are so well versed and have written this incredible book that I highly recommend you all reading. But before we get into like the nitty gritty, um, Ben and Shane, how did you come to this project? Like, what part of your work, your Judaism, all of that brought you to want to take this project on?
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I'm sure I speak for Shayna as well that, it's been so amazing to see the growth of the ACJ in this time, and it's just an honor to be, to be invited to, to be part of it. Yeah, I mean, so I grew up, in suburban DC, in Silver Spring, Maryland. I was raised in a conservative synagogue, and I originally, I think I kind of, developed a more radical Jewish politics, I think, through Israel Palestine. In 2011, I actually, spent I had a couple of friends who were Baal Teshuva and convinced me to go to a Baal Teshuva yeshiva
You see what
in
Paul
Israel.
Stuva is, just in case folks don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah. Baal Teshuva is a movement of like, American Jews who are unaffiliated who become more religious. Traditionally, it most often, refers to kind of embracing, ultra Orthodox or Hasidic, practice, though it is broader than that. But yeah, long story short, I went on a religious trip to Israel, in 2011 after college. And then I spent some time in the yeshiva, and then I spent many months in the West Bank doing solidarity work. And, from then on, I really, kind of developed, a Judaism, beyond nationalism, beyond Zionism. I spent some years w working for Jewish Voice for Peace, on college campuses, and I saw, firsthand how anti-Semitism charges can be misused to attack the movement for Palestinian rights. And then, like many American Jews, with the rise of Trump and the alt-right, the question of anti-Semitism, took on new urgency. And I now work at a think tank called Political Research Associates, where I monitor and write about a far right and white Christian nationalist movements. And I met Shane in that work. Both of us were covering the far right, 5 years ago or so during the first Trump administration. And both of us were really saw the need for like a new analysis of anti-Semitism that that approached it from like a collective a liberation perspective. And so I reached out to him, and long story short, we ended up working on this together.
Mhm. Yeah, thanks a lot, Ben, for introducing that, and Andy for having us. We're both really excited to be a part and support the project as it's continuing to grow. Yeah, I mean, as Ben sort of said, I have spent the last 10 years or so ago researching the far right and anti-fascist social movements. And so there was never any question about the centrality of anti-Semitism to the American far right and white nationalism. But as you dig a lot deeper and try to understand it, most of the work that confronts anti-Semitism, whether it's institutional or research, really has a particular bent to it. One that centers anti-Zionism a lot more than we would, one that has a kind of deep roots in kind of the larger organizational Jewish structure. And so if we wanted to take it seriously, but we wanted to take it from an anti-fascist or from a social movement lens, there wasn't a lot of places to go to get those foundations. And so that's where a lot of our work has come from. Is like, if we don't find it, we just want to build it. We want to create that foundation and help create kind of communal consensus around that. And so we started working on that, first hashing out our own ideas about it, and then building over time what we thought of as kind of our approach, how we would intervene on the discussion, using some of the resources that exist and then trying to fill the gaps where we thought they were lacking.
Awesome. Yeah. And my read of it, you did a lot. You succeeded, right? I remember just not that long ago when I was in congregational work wanting to teach on anti-Semitism, and the resources that were available really all came from the like the kind of folks who would today call themselves centrists, but are really kind of right wing. and that it had this kind of sense of anti-Semitism as this eternal force that was the phrase the oldest hatred, all of that, this exceptionalization of anti-Semitism as a form of hate. And I think your book does a really good job of kind of pulling at those threads. And so I'd love for you guys to talk a little bit about like what is anti-Semitism then? How would you define it, both as in a historic sense and today? And is it a continuous thing? Like, is it one thing that has continued throughout history and just kind of maintained?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think so. The way that we talk about anti-Semitism is that we do sort of agree on a certain level with the common definition. You know, it's hatred or prejudice or an ideology that positions itself against Jews as Jews. The way that we sort of intervene on this discourse, though, is by looking specifically at the ideology that comes out of Christian Europe and evolves with modernity to a conspiracy theory about Jews. A lot of times when you read anti-Semitism discourse, it assumes there's a communal consensus about Jewish flourishing or about Jewish interests, and therefore anything opposed to that would then obviously be anti-Semitism structurally. And we take a different position. We look at the history of Christian theology as it developed, particularly as it merged with kind of imperial powers in Europe, and the ways that they understood Jews. Again, emerges out of Christian supersessionism, the idea that Jesus and the church replaced Jews as God's chosen people, and then the kind of conspiratorial or demonic kind of view of Jews that started to take shape, particularly after the Crusades. And then we watch as that idea does develop an influence over time and become secularized around the 17th and 18th century, as we start to have pseudoscientific ideas both about politics and about race. And that really evolves in that strange. I would say that the question you have about whether it's a continuous sort of hatred or force, I would say that it has influences over time. So we have kind of earlier anti-Semitic ideas that have familiarity to the conspiracy theories we have now, but are really explicitly theological, and they're positioned more in the rhetoric of the church and within Christianity. And then as we get in the 1900s and or in the 18th and 19th century, we start to hear it like it's expressed more in secular views. And by the 20th century, this is very much expressed with race science and through kind of secularized politics. And it does have a sort of Christian inflection to it. It definitely has the ideas, have their roots in certain kinds of Christian theology, but it changes profoundly over time.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think anti-Semitism today, like Shane said, is a conspiracy theory that positions, that points the finger at a hidden kind of secret cabal of Jews, lurking at the height of government or finance, or the media, or left social movements. So today, you might hear about, George Soros is the hidden hand behind, Black Lives Matter, or the globalist cabal, is engineering non-white immigration to destroy white America, or a cabal of cultural Marxists in the university system to turn our children, trans, right? And this is a way that for over a century, authoritarian and nationalist leaders have channeled popular discontent, especially in times of crisis, at this false image of absolute, power. The reason it's on the rise today, is because, much like, far right populism is on the rise. We're living in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, in an era of global destabilization from wars and refugee crises, and the COVID pandemic and so much else. And millions of people are desperate and eager for answers. And these conspiracy theories help people punch up. They give an outlet for that anger, for that alienation, and they help people punch up. Whereas, and I think nationalists and right wingers love this, especially because it diverts forces away from a more progressive and liberatory understanding of the world. Social movements who push for radical change we also punch up in a way, but we just have better answers. Our answer is it's the systems of racial capitalism that are keeping millions of people divided and exploited, right? So anti-Semitism really is a competing theory of the way the world works. And time and again, we especially see authoritarians and nationalists, not only them, but largely them, use it in these moments of crisis to channel popular rage away from a liberatory agenda and onto like a false, mirage.
Yeah. Yeah, the kind of like classic scapegoating thing, certainly. Um, and one of my secret, um, what is like my toxic faves has been listening to conspiracy theory podcasts for like decades now.
Yeah.
And it's funny to see like that structure maintain, and like sometimes just instead of Jews they say it's like aliens or lizard people or something else, right? But it's that same
Hmm.
sort of structure, that there is this like this cabal that's controlling everything. um,
Yeah.
and one of the things that you just said, Ben, really spurred a question. It's a tough one, and this gets at the core of like the discourse that I think you all were trying to intervene in, which is like what happens when there is this layer of Jewish nationalism that is participating with that echelon of power in the world legitimately, right?
Hmm.
Like things that used to be very clearly false because Jews didn't have a state. Jews didn't have nuclear weapons or the kind of nationalist power that Israel has today and purports to use on behalf of all Jews around the world, even though I think all three of
Yeah.
us would say they don't, but they say they do. Like, how do you kind of dissect that aspect of anti-Semitism when it even rears its own head through
Yeah.
Jewish nationalism?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in a way, this problem you're naming, it's not necessarily new. I mean, a century ago, anti-Semites loved to talk about, the Rothschilds as the arch puppeteers of everything under the sun. And there was a family named the Rothschilds who did have power, and they were, well connected, within the British imperial machine. The thing is, they were part of the larger British imperial machine. And what nationalists did was they could like single out this one piece of it and use it to explain the whole thing, right? So it's kind of similar today. I mean, George Soros, like he supports some progressive causes, and that's great. He's also a venture capitalist who made um, his money through not great practices on the stock market. So nationalists can use that to kind of exploit popular rage, or of course, APAC, very much is one piece of a broader machinery that helps keep U.S. support for Israel in place. And we don't want to, God forbid, say that people shouldn't criticize, AIPAC for the real power it holds, or criticize the system of Jewish supremacy in Palestine that facilitates domination over Palestinians. It's about telling that within a larger story of let's look at AIPAC, and let's look at Christian Zionism, and let's look at weapons profiteers, and let's look at the interests of U.S. empire, and a bipartisan political consensus. All these pieces help to uphold Jewish supremacy in Palestine. And so, yeah, it's just not true that APAC is a many tentacled kind of octopus at the heart of it all or something. So it's really just about clarifying our power analysis.
Yeah, I mean, like Ben said, like Israel's position of power in the region emerges as a piece of Western empire, not as a piece of Jewish communal kind of politics necessarily. But I think it's also worthwhile to take even a step back from this question and say, like, even the assumption of Jewish power in this case assumes a unified Jewish community, that the Jews have power, that's power going to all Jews, instead of them expressing what's much more important in their position, their wealth, right? So, like, we talk about this a lot when it comes to like the Anti-Defamation League, which arguably is the largest Jewish organization, is supposed to speak for Jews. But which Jews does it speak for? Affluent, middle class to affluent Jews of a certain background, of certain political class, right? And actually, if we look throughout history, there's been a huge break of Jewish politics in almost every generation where people actually don't agree with the quote unquote communal consensus about power. And so I think it's worthwhile to even take a step back from that and say, like, hey, are they speaking as Jews, or are they speaking from a particular economic and social class, and they're expressing those interests instead?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and something I kind of want to segue into, which is in your book. And I found it to be like really fascinating because it's a piece that doesn't get talked about too much, which is the like history of anti-Semitism on the left that comes through communism, that might even kind of show, like, I think it's different now in America, in the class analysis you just described, Shane. The norms are different, but I've seen people, online, whatever, talk about how, like, on the left there there is this continuation of communist anti-Semitism from the Soviet Union that's expressing itself, which may have less to do with the class analysis in contemporary America. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So the kind of analysis you're talking about, we only kind of get touched on it briefly because I think it's actually more complicated. The assumption there is that the root of what quote unquote left anti-Semitism, particularly what they would say in anti-imperialist circles, comes from the kind of Stalinist unwillingness to ascribe Jews peoplehood or nationhood. And so that ends up being the root, the questioning of a Jewish sort of national cohesiveness. I think we would actually call into question certain kind of national conceptions of Jewishness ourselves, right? So I think it ends up being kind of complicated in how that plays out. I think there's a certain suspicion of Jewish kind of collective action that may have emerged from that tradition, but it's also a lot older than that too. Historically, a large part of what we would call anti-Semitic conspiracy theories was also called the socialism of fools. So it expressed a kind of anti-capitalist sentiment, but it understood power incorrectly, right? It exceptionalized it. It focused on these particular capitalists or these particular institutions rather than the system as such. And that, when you're thinking a little bit about the origins of anti-Semitism, comes because of the way that anti-Semitic theories were used to detract attention away from the nobility, away from the people who actually controlled the economy, and onto folks that were forced into money lending or tax collecting, things like that. And so there's a certain kind of strain of thought that exceptionalizes those things and points in a different direction. And in a lot of ways, when you have populist theories that don't really delve very deeply into systems, that don't have much to say about systems as structures, and don't really address those fundamental problems, then it's really easy to pick in conspiracy theories. They essentially express the same kind of anger. They have the same kind of conditions from which they emerge, but they don't actually get at the root of anything. And that's a large part of where anti-Semitic conspiracy theories tend to sit, both on the right and the left. Because remember, both the right and the left oftentimes claim to speak for working class people. They claim to challenge the elites, right? Which is why we point out in the book, the right is much, much, much more likely to hold on to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, both because of their nationalism and because they have no actual interest in addressing the economic conditions that created the problem in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll just add to that, there is we talk a bit in the book about, how I think in the 60s and 70s and maybe 80s in the Soviet Union, there were some forms of like anti-Zionism that did, lean on conspiracy theories. Zionism was kind of named as the kind of the source of world domination, or like the power behind Zionism was like a global network of powerful Jews, rather than systems of colonialism and imperialism, and the U.S. ruling class that keeps the blood and the arms flowing in Palestine, and it's mostly non-Jewish, right? So these conspiracy theories were there, and some people, I don't think there's a straight line you can draw from, the 70s in the Soviet Union to today. I actually think that, many folks on the right who do try to construct that argument, and I would be a lot more careful. But I do think that since October 7th and before, we do see, if you go on Twitter, there's a lot of stuff there that there are, people do float conspiracy theories that yeah, you talk about, Zionist cabals, infiltrating U.S. government, or that print out a list of members of the Biden administration and put Stars of David next to everyone's name and say that Chuck Schumer is a dual citizen of Israel, and all this, there's these tropes, these ideas can definitely appear in some kinds of anti-Zionism, and we saw that for a long time in the white nationalist movement. Also, I mean, David Duke, a leading white nationalist, was the person who coined Zio as a slur essentially. And we're in a moment when a lot of people are radicalizing around Palestine, for the first time, and these things, can be in the mix. And then the right, of course, seizes on moments when they do show up, and paints an outsized portrait of threats to Jews from a movement that's overwhelmingly about justice and freedom for Palestinians. So I really do think it's important for us to educate ourselves on where these anti-Semitic ideas come from, and to keep a clear analysis of power, in Israel Palestine.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned Chuck Schumer of all people, because he also just wrote a book on anti-Semitism, um, which I haven't read, but I would guess is quite different from yours.
Yeah, probably.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's not
um,
great.
yeah. Did you read it, Shane?
I did, yeah. No, it's not
Yeah.
fantastic.
Um, and but one of the questions is, like, obviously Chuck Schumer is not a dual citizen, right? We know this.
Yes,
He
yes,
didn't serve in the IDF. Um,
yes.
and he is a relatively powerful person in American politics who does in fact put Israel's interests very high on the docket of what he wants to support, right? Or what he does support. Um, and so, like, how do you draw the line where especially, I guess this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but I promise it's coming back.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, for sure.
that we've got every loud voice in the American population that purports to speak on behalf of Jews, saying regularly for decades now that 90 some odd percent of Jews are Zionists. And so then when you like criticize Israel or criticize Zionism, what you're doing is criticizing Jews, right? Like creating this kind
Hmm.
of straw man.
Hmm.
Um, and Jews are about 2% of the population of America. So
Hmm.
when most Americans hear this, they're going to take it at face value and be like, okay, that's what these folks are saying. They speak on behalf of
Yeah,
all Jews, so I guess we're going to believe that.
yeah,
And then they also see someone with power in the government who is using that power to continue supporting Israel and standing with and wanting to continue arming it.
yeah,
Um, and so how where I guess, like, A, how do you hold people accountable for being able to have enough knowledge to have the nuance that is necessary to articulate a critique of Zionism, of Israel, of Chuck Schumer, when the primary bodies of that purport to speak on behalf of American Jews, which again I want to be clear, do not. They say they do, but they
hmm,
don't. Um, are constantly feeding them the information that would lead them to these assumptions, right? And
yeah,
it's hard to find a counter argument.
yeah. No, I mean, I think you're really pointing to, a sad reality that I think, in the 21st century, in a really broad sense, Zionist politics today can feed into anti-Semitism sometimes. I mean, studies have shown that, in the last, 20 years, Israeli Israeli military offensives in Gaza with high Palestinian civilian casualties, corresponded to upticks in anti-Semitism directed against Jews in the diaspora. Peter Beinart cites these studies a lot. And we need only to look around, the world today to see that is true. And I think, when the state of Israel, carries out horrific atrocities and claims to speak in the name of world Jewry, and when highly visible, Jewish communal representatives like Jonathan Greenblatt, echo that claim. It does, help to create a condition that can make Jews less safe. And I think, one important way to counteract that, I think it's no small thing that the growing movements of Jews who are saying not in our name, one way to understand that politics, it's a Palestine solidarity politics, of course, and I think it's also a kind of anti-Semitism politics in itself, because we are rejecting this conflation of Jewishness and Zionism. And so I do think it's important for non-Jewish activists to keep this in mind, and I think it's important, to name that, that the forces that are conflating the two in today's world are overwhelmingly Zionist movements, including many non-Jewish Zionist movements like Christian Zionism.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll pick that up. I think, one sort of reality is that like having this dynamic doesn't sort of invent anti-Semitism in the public. It allows people to sort of pick up on contemporary incidents and then feed it back into a sort of anti-Semitic frame that people have lots and lots of history with, right? Conspiracy theories have a big part in forming the sort of Western conception of rank and file politics. So there's plenty of that going around that they can kind of slot that into. But I think one of the dynamics that's always true about anti-Semitism is that it's not true. And discussing like the reality that Jewish American communal politics are deeply inflected with kind of pro-Israel sentiment is just, a reality. And it started talking about how politics plays out. And I don't think that that's to discuss that and to acknowledge that actually does play into sort of anti-Semitic tropes. And I think what's distinctly different when we're looking at actually anti-Semitism when it plays out in an allegedly Palestine solidarity context is that it's deeply conspiratorial and disconnected from reality, right? It has a completely incorrect and outside understanding of what Jews are and what Judaism is. It really points into elements of Judaism itself or of Jewish ethnic consciousness or of Jewish sort of like self-activity as inherently problematic and leading therefore to these X, Y, and Z Zionist politics, when the reality is that Zionist politics are like any form of imperial politics. It's inflected with a lot of sort of like Western power, Western capital. And the way that we actually address it, the way that we actually unseat that is by challenging those systems entirely.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that was a very good answer. And it's something you two both keep coming back to, which I think is really important, which is just always taking the step back and like really making clear who does have the power, where the power is actually lying in and helping to redirect people's thinking to that. Because I think that undoes the entire web rather than fighting the individual strands of the web of anti-Semitism. You're just getting beyond it entirely, which I think is a much better approach, and one that unfortunately it seems like most of the people tasked with fighting anti-Semitism don't do. Um, Instead, they just like fight tropes and say it's bad. Um, but one other question I have with regard to this is how do you, when like let's say you're in conversation with someone that you're doing good like left work with that says something kind of essentializing about Jews. It's not like they're not saying something crazy like Jews drink baby's blood or something, but something that maybe steps over the line a little bit. And well, how would you approach that interaction? Like, what is it that you would want to communicate, and how would you communicate to them what they've said that is wrong, and how would you do it I guess like underneath this question is, um, I think there's a lot of reactivity, and it's the same way that like people being accused of racism or like I don't have a racist bone in my body type thing, right? Like rather than being able to listen and understand why what they said was racist. Like how do you work to diffuse that issue when you're working in solidarity with people who like, you know, live in this world that does just have some ambient anti-Semitism floating around, so they might express it sometimes.
I mean, I think the first thing that people do is assess what's possible in the situation and also how threatening something is. I have been in situations where someone says something anti-Semitic that is more like Jews drink babies' blood. And that is a different situation entirely. At that point,
Yeah.
we're talking about like whether or not these relationships are viable or safe. But one mistake people often make is that the assumption is that if you see anti-Semitism pop its head up, it's going to be the tip of the iceberg, that it's actually going to be deeply inlaid. And that is an ultimate mistake. And it's a mistake because that comes from the fact that white nationalist politics are really distinguished themselves from sort of like more generic right-wing politics through anti-Semitism. It's actually one of the sort of like American taboos that holds a little bit from mainstream politics. And so when you see anti-Semitism, particularly of a particular variety, come out, you say, okay, wow, someone's actually is much further sort of radicalized, quote unquote, than we thought. But that's actually not true in most daily situations, particularly in the kind of spaces you're talking about. And so a lot of times it's something that you actually just want to sort of address it like you would any kind of oppressive behavior. And I think, again, let's like think that anti-Semitism is not exceptional. This happens all the time. In every left-wing space I've been in, I've heard racist stuff, transphobic stuff, sexist stuff. This happens actually pretty regularly. If you look at statistical studies inside a left-wing social movement, people have the same level of problematic behaviors they have out in the world because people are, just normal folks that are exposed to all kinds of stuff. So figuring out ways to address that. I mean, and we talk about this a lot in the book. The best way to address things is through deep relationships. We talked, one person that we interviewed was from a kind of progressive Jewish organization, and they had developed an anti-Semitism training. And once it was ready to happen, they had a bunch of their organizational partners come and sit through it and give them feedback and that kind of thing. And as they explained to me, those partners just sat there and said some of the most anti-Semitic things they'd ever heard. Things like, well, okay, so how do we talk about the real estate market when we know that the Manhattan real estate market is controlled by Jews, or we know that Jews are disproportionately bankers? How do we talk about that? And so they basically had a choice, right? Like, do I walk away? I don't want to be a part of this. That was super offensive. Or do we address it and see how it goes? And they addressed it one at a time. And people were like, oh, I'm so sorry. I guess I never even thought about that. And it made a lot of progress. I don't want to say that those conversations go like that every time. They certainly don't. But if you're deeply invested in working with people, you're invested through their bad behavior, right? Because actually that's what it's going to take to build large revolutionary movements is people working on their things together. I know that when I walk into a space, I'm probably bringing a lot of baggage that I didn't even realize. And so we have to be willing to actually have a piece of that out. It doesn't mean not having standards, and it doesn't mean avoiding, issues of safety. Inside anti-fascist organizing, if you talk to a lot of like militant anti-fascist organizers, they will tell you about campaigns they've had there inside the left, right? Really virulent campaigns, because sometimes that stuff gets pretty bad in allegedly left-wing spaces, anti-war movement, deep green movements, things like that. But if you're not there to actually sort of address people's bad ideas, then you're not actually building the kind of social movement that has the capacity to take on anything in power.
Yeah, I mean, you really, yeah. Plus one, all that. I would just kind of echo, relationships are the beginning and the middle and the end of all of this. If you don't have a deep history of working with someone, if you haven't, built up the trust of showing up together, over the long haul, there's a greater chance that, it's not going to go well, but I think if you two are really in it together, then there's more trust there. And the person might not, might have a defensive reaction, might not agree with you right away. There's a lot of factors here. Identity, plays a big role, right? I mean, context, plays a big role. But at the end of the day, a person is going to react a lot better if you have that relationship. And I think there's often a lot of fear and distrust that comes into this. I mean, I know I feel it. The prospect of pulling someone that I'm in a movement relationship with, aside and saying that something was anti-Semitic, can be can be scary. There can be a lot of fear that might make us, want to run away, or like Shane said, it might make us think that, if there's some anti-Semitism there, this person, basically wants to kill us, but I think, as much as we can, having some trust that most people, do want to have our backs. Most people, do, and people want to know, if they actually, are replicating anti-Semitic ideology, they want to know. They don't want to further that in the world. They don't want to be harmful to Jewish people, and they also, don't want to do that, in a situation where the right could go after them, if that becomes, public, which is a reality in our world. And so I think it's really important, to tell people and to try to have some trust that, our friends and our comrades want to have our backs on this stuff.
Yeah, especially going after that last point. I mean, I'm in New York, and so like I see the right just constantly trying to get Zoran Mamdani uh, like taken out for anti-Semitism, right? Like, and there is this thing that I think is actually really important when engaging with people who are like saying things like Zoran is anti-Semitic or whatever, which is like there are certainly bad actors out there who knowingly falsely say this stuff and drum this stuff up in a knowingly false way. And then just judging from like some people I know and like reading stuff online that people write, I think a whole lot of the people that end up furthering these talking points, it's not in bad faith. They're scared. They like believe it and they're legitimately scared. Um,
Mhm.
and so this is kind of the same question from the opposite end. Like, how do you go about talking to those people that um, are deeply, deeply afraid of anti-Semitism? They believe the ADL when they hear the ADL says someone or something is anti-Semitic. They believe that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic and a danger, like a like actual danger to them. Um,
Mhm.
how do you go about having those conversations with people? Have you succeeded in helping in changing minds? And
Yeah.
maybe one added layer to this question is like, why do you think some Jews respond that way and some don't, right? Like, where do you think that difference is?
Yeah. No, I mean, essentially, I think the answer is the same, and it's, staying in relationship, over the long haul. Those of us who are able to, who are well positioned to, whether it's, yeah, family members or friends. I have had some cases. It's not always, overnight. It's not always through sending, it's not as if, sending one article to somebody is going to change them. But I think it's staying in it over the long haul, being open to having conversations, to having, to texting back and forth, to answering their DMs, and staying present with them, and just, over the long haul, yeah, yeah, demonstrating that you care about anti-Semitism, that you take it seriously, that you're not negating their fear, or delegitimizing it, but yeah, showing where you stand and being real with them, I think can change people. I think people change. Sometimes it's a process of, learning more about, say, the genocide in Gaza, going through a whole process of questioning, and some of their priors, and going through, unlearning. And sometimes it's, with Zoran, I've heard stories of, Jews in New York who like him because of his economic policies, who, are won over, who just have, some trust through the, agenda he's putting forward, to make New Yorkers' lives better. And, from there, they might start to see like, hey, there's a community of New York Jews who actually, do support this guy, and they are also very proud and, unapologetically Jewish. And, people can start to glimpse, alternate ways of being Jewish. I can start to kind of, step out of the kind of echo chamber that can often, keep these fears locked in place.
I think one of the most effective ways to actually address this is to provide a sort of provably effective model of safety, something people can look at and depend on and have seen work. Because I think what a lot of drives these politics is the feeling that the communities around them won't protect you, and that we're inheriting this sort of long-term generational unsafety. And so people are going to look around and want to see people that actually validate their experiences, that want to hold them up and want to be in community with them and want to protect them if and when threats happen. And I think like the ability of us to build those communities, to build social movements that can do that, has a long-term sort of corrosive effect on the Zionist narrative about Jewish unsafety. I think sometimes it comes from real generational trauma. I think sometimes it comes from the constant repetition of sort of a Zionist framing, which it sort of presents Jewish history as this just one unceasing sort of lineage of traumas, which is both inaccurate and unhelpful. And so I think part of it is about giving people access to a larger vision of what Jewish life has been, generations of Jewish flourishing, Jewish communities around the world, things like that. Giving people a real access to their Jewishness, I think actually gives them a lot of that safety. Part of, I think, people's break with Zionism is watching the reality of Zionism. But I actually think a lot of people are seeing that and still unsure of how they're going to feel safe without it. And we're willing to accept a great deal of sort of horror because of the sort of strain that fear places on people. So I think having those things work in concert, giving people viable options of communal safety at the same time as sort of showing them clearly that the promise that Zionism has made about Jewish safety, particularly in Israel, Palestine, is not actually living up the way they've had to explain to them.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm trying to do,
Mhm.
right? So, so I agree. Um, so I wonder, like, where have you seen that working well? What modes of kind of like transnational Jewish identity or like understanding of Judaism that doesn't rely on a sense of nationhood of all Jews? Um, like, have you seen that function well in some places or not? Um, as the kind of grounding for that new way you're talking about?
I think that there is a different conception of Jewish peoplehood that I think has been popular amongst a lot of the Jewish left, other people that try and find kind of a refashion. How is a Jewish communal identity different from the kind of ethnic nationalism that Zionism was built on? And sort of build out those communal bonds that have a long, deep history and trying to get at some of the cores of them. What is positive about those? What do you want to bring into the future? What holds Jewish communities together outside of that sort of like Zionist ethnic political context, right? And a lot of people, I think, are building those. I think a lot of it is built around different forms of practice, whether it's explicitly religious practice or more traditions of Jewish secularism. I think both of those sort of binds people together. And I think that's actually becoming increasingly important to people. Part of what I see as the shift amongst young Jews away from Zionism is actually a shift in the direction of Jewish identity. And we're trying to find refashions of Jewish peoplehood or actually getting involved in kind of Jewish life, including the growth of kind of traditional egalitarian
Mhm.
worship centers and people being involved in different ways. I think a lot of that is about people trying to find different fashions of Jewish identity. One thing I think it's always useful that people kind of point out is that Zionism as a sort of alternative for fashioning a complete Jewish identity and complete Jewish community is often kind of vapid and leaves people empty all on its own. And so people are kind of finding those alternatives. I think the kind of reclamation of the Jewish left, not that it went anywhere, but that it sort of had a lot of resurgence. I think that has historically been a lot of where that energy is put in, where people are finding a lot of those bonds and doing that a lot of that building. And so I think you're actually going to see a lot of there's experimentation happening and people trying to reclaim different parts of the tradition, and it's growing pretty rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's almost a cliche, or maybe not. Maybe we have to keep saying it, but in the circles that we're in, it's a cliche. But yeah, we are in a moment of resurgence of the Jewish left that like I see it really embodied by, ACJ, by Rabbis for Ceasefire, by groups like JVP and If Not Now, and JFRED in New York, by, many other, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, progressive, shuls and minyanim and Havarot all around the country. And by the vigorous participation, like Shane said, of Jews and broader left organizing. Yeah, I mean, I think we are, in many ways, I felt this way a decade ago, and I felt it since October 7th, and I still feel it today. It ebbs and flows, but we're in a moment, we're in the midst of a shift where the old ways of being and doing Jewish, in the US, are no longer working, and where, to butcher Gramsci, the old is dying and the new has not yet, been born, but is in the process of emerging. And I think we're, at that turning point now. And, the Civil War inside the American Jewish community is ongoing, and it's not going to happen, overnight. But I think we are in the midst of building, kind of a counter-hegemonic, new visions of Jewish life that I think are, we don't have names for it yet. There are names that are being thrown around, diasporism, there's many others, but we're all building it together. And I see, organizations like this one and many others as, really part of that process.
Um, so on that note, um, it's been about a year since your book came out, I think. Um, what's next? Is there anything that you have learned in the past year that you wish you had made it into the book? And B, are you guys working on anything else together? Are you working on individual projects that people should check out? Anything like that?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I feel like, yeah, maybe one thing I wish had made it more into the book is, the way that, that critiques of Israel can also emerge, on the right, and the risk of anti-Semitism there, the relationship of anti-Semitism there, because we are seeing in the last few months more and more voices in the MAGA camp that are
Mhm.
increasingly, disillusioned with Israel, and there are questions that, some of that, I think is nurtured by anti-Semitism or can foment anti-Semitism or is in relationship with it. And so that's definitely something I think we all have to wrap our heads around. There's other things too, but that's one I just thought of. But yeah, I mean, what's next? Yeah, we aren't working on anything together in the moment, but I'll say I'm working on a new project on Christian Zionism that I hope to could have more on soon. I was doing a lot of writing and thinking about, understanding Christian Zionism and really helping people kind of see it, in our world. Often I think we have a very kind of, yeah, we know, like, one or two talking points about it, but helping people have a deeper understanding of where it came from and where it's going.
So,
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question. We turned in the first draft for our book just a couple of days before October 7th. And so we went back and added a certain amount, but there was limited, it was limited to what we could actually add in there. I think, one thing that's become really clear is just the central role that anti-Semitism plays in the discourse, particularly coming from the center and the right, as just animating almost every one of their attacks. And it sort of does mimic ways in which Jews had outside role in the narratives that, Christian leaders had used. And there's a sort of familiarity to that, particularly now in which we see, like, the Trump administration and the MAGA movement in general constantly invoking Jews, or the way that Project Esther is sort of a way of mobilizing Jewish identity as an attack against all the institutions of the left. It's just been so outsized and so outweighed that I think that is something that's really worth talking about. And I think that will end up being a lot of the ways the central focus when we discuss this in the future. As for other projects, I'm working on two books. One is called Heal the World. It's about the resurgence of the Jewish left. And then another book about mass anti-fascist movements, and particularly when the far right takes state power. And it's called How to Start a Revolution.
Sorry. So now uh, it's up to everybody else that's on the Zoom. Um, do you got questions? We talked about a lot. This is a major moment in especially American history, as Shane was just saying, for how anti-Semitism is being um, centered in every discussion happening in our country. And so, like, there's no question that's too small or too big or too simple. I think that everyone is trying to kind of figure their way out through this. So folks who are on the Zoom would love it if you'd ask some questions. I'm actually going to give you the ability to unmute yourself. Um, and yeah, don't be shy. Feel free. Or if you are shy and still want to ask a question, feel free to put it in the chat. Yes, our fearless leader, Steve Naiman.
Well, I don't know about fearless or leader, but I've enjoyed the conversation greatly. And thank you for writing your book. It seems to me that uh, anti-Semitism is such a broad term that everything anybody says uh, is considered anti-Semitic. I'm 78 years old, and I really don't feel I've ever been the center of anti-Semitism, but there's certainly a lot of ignorance that I've encountered, and I view those as very different. I view the person's motivation for maybe saying something is uh, is not anti-Semitic. It's just ignorance, and yet the ADL seems to think that everything that's said and done is anti-Semitic. So I wonder how we can help people understand that uh, that there is a difference, and that um, people need to be uh, aware of it, and maybe less sensitive, I guess is the word, because I think it takes away from the real anti-Semitism that's out there when everything else is just bunched into the discussion. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I'll jump in here. It's interesting that like it's framed as like the ADL thinks everything is anti-Semitism, because I might actually counter and say that there's a lot of things that are clearly anti-Semitic that aren't really on the ADL's radar, right? Like they don't spend a ton of time talking about Christian Zionism. Elon Musk's various escapades were often defended by the ADL, even though everyone kind of looked around and said, like, this looks like consensus anti-Semitism, particularly with the recent sort of changes to the AI system inside X, formerly Twitter, is now kind of responding with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So I think they actually picked what feels like politically useful examples of anti-Semitism, right? And then other stuff just kind of goes by the wayside. I did a project where I went through the ADL's um, went through the ADL's records for, it wasn't this last year calendar year, but it was the year before that. And a lot of things when it came to actual neo-Nazi events, this was, Goyim Defense League, Blood Tribe, these are, very serious neo-Nazi crews, weren't listed as anti-Semitism. They were listed as something else. And so I think it's interesting because I think we have this perception that they overinflate anti-Semitism when I think actually they're looking in a lot of the wrong places, right? Like they actually present an outsized view of it inside these protest encampments and an undersized view of it coming from the right. But I think you're getting at an interesting point too. And we talked about this. We talked about a number of events. We talked about it in the book. There's a difference sometimes between the sort of xenophobia of someone not being Christian or not being like me and anti-Semitism, which is more ideological and more conceptual. And I'd say those things should be handled a little bit differently. Though I would actually kind of point out that a lot of times those ignorant comments that you come with actually do come with kind of anti-Semitic ideas about Jews underneath them, just assumptions people make. And I think those are actually relatively simple, right? Those are the kinds of things that you address interpersonally. You know, if someone comes in and says something casually racist, there's an assessment of like, well, can we talk about this thing? Is that casually racist remark from ignorance? Just because it's from ignorance doesn't mean it's not casually racist, right? It doesn't mean like that, but it does mean that they'll probably hear it and they'll probably want to make movement on it, that kind of thing. And one of the problems ends up being is that anytime people hear something anti-Semitic or something they think is anti-Semitic, they assume that's David Duke on the other end. And that's not necessarily true, right? And so they actually don't. Like, there's not an effort of crossing that. And I think part of the reason is that the way that the organizations like the ADL and a lot of other anti-Semitism organizations present anti-Semitism is as something that's fundamentally uncurable, that it's something that's kind of built into the Gentile mind and the Gentile society, that there's literally nothing we can do about it. We can only kind of mitigate its most egregious harms. And I simply don't believe that. I actually think that these are the effects of an unequal and unjust world, that we can do something about it. And so that's part of, I think, why I would approach that differently. And what do you think, Ben?
No, I mean, you nailed it. I think it's just, I really heard in that question, Steve, a desire to like not let our fear make it hard for us to see who our allies might be. And I really appreciated, yeah, your attempt to really, make that distinction and to stay in relationship with people who might have some ignorance, and recognize that we ourselves, have ignorance, that we don't know is there until we are aware of it, at which point it's no longer ignorance by definition. So yeah, I really appreciate your openness there.
All right, we have two very simple questions in the chat to answer in 4 minutes. One is from Lauren Summers, who asked, how might a membership organization move forward to combat anti-Semitism when we have multiple factions within the large Jewish membership who don't agree about what anti-Semitism is? And each group insists that their position must be adopted or the organization itself is anti-Semitic. Either of you want to field that?
Yeah. I mean, it's just, yeah, I think, we started doing book events, I think, just over a year ago. And this kind of question is one we heard so many times. I think the discourse around this and so many of our institutions are broken. And there's a lot of infighting in our Jewish institutions, and it's a big question. Like, how do we prevent that from tearing us apart? It's like, the adage, two Jews, three opinions, but the stakes are very, very high. And I feel for you, and I would hope that maybe, listening sessions, really deep relational work, creating spaces where people can, make sure their voices are heard and feel their voice heard, and make sure, as much as we can, try to get folks from the varying factions in the same room with each other, building relationship with each other, and maybe, from there, the path forward to some kind of consensus can emerge that doesn't involve tearing the organization apart. But I think it's also very important really to make sure everyone's voice is heard, even folks you might disagree with. And I think in these situations, folks who have more left-wing views can find their voices to be silenced. And I think it's very important to make sure that doesn't happen as well.
Yeah, I think the bigger issue in that equation is it's tearing the organization apart. We let a lot of things tear organizations apart and relationships. And I think that is actually in a lot of ways more important than the question about like how do we define anti-Semitism? Are people able to get through disagreements? Are people able to come through and hash out arguments on these things? Or is the question just so volatile and so upsetting that actually progress can't be made? And in that case, like we actually haven't set up a situation in which a community is able the ability to do really anything productive. And so I think building out those relationships so you have the ability to take on something challenging is the most important thing. I think a lot of times organizations test themselves with the hardest possible things that they're going to have to decide on, or problems that they're going to have to solve. But really, we have to build up our capacity to withstand those sorts of disagreements. Anti-Semitism is not like how we define it, how we understand it, how we address it. It's not that fundamentally different than how we do that with a lot of social forces, right? That's a lot of debate that's going to happen there. Ben and I have some of our own ideas when we disagree about other things. So it's just like other people will disagree with us. And that is the work of actually hashing that out is what we're going to have to do in the practical real world setting.
Great. Yeah. And it goes back to what really is fundamental to your whole book. The solidarity and dealing with these issues is all about building relationships and trust and staying in it with people. There's so much heart in the way that you guys think about this and act on it, and I love it. Um, One last question from Carolyn and Martin Karcher. How can we avoid letting the issue of anti-Semitism distract us from fighting against the genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, I can start with this. I mean, there's fundamentally different questions, and we can't let them be the same question. I think we so often let them be the same question because there's a whole institutional infrastructure that determines that they are going to be in the same conversation. But I don't see them as fundamentally the same. I don't see them like even having a profound amount of overlap. Anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism if it exists in the Palestine movement or not. We'll discuss it on its own terms, but has no effect on our work to stop the genocide in Palestine. And so I think like that's why I think largely keep those conversations separate, because like we are not talking about some kind of continuity whereby someone becomes so anti-Zionist that they dip into anti-Semitism, right? We see those as kind of fundamentally different ideas. And so even if we address anti-Semitism when it comes up, even when it's in the Palestine movement, that's just part of the work that we do addressing oppressive behaviors inside social movements, something we would do every day in any other situation, right? And just if we see those sorts of things, that doesn't sort of distract us from the regular larger work we have to do. I think so often we want to be kind of pulled out of our organizing work by these sort of things to treat them as distractions. But if we don't see that as distractions, if we don't see them having the natural overlap, then I don't think it actually interferes one with the other.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. Also, I want to use this moment to lift up Carolyn Karcher's amazing book, Reclaiming Judaism from Zionism. So thank you, Carolyn, for putting that book out into the world. It's got a lot of great voices who have been leading on this issue. So yeah, just want to give a shout out. But yeah, I mean, I think yes, and I also, not in our movement spaces, but I am very aware that there is a tendency in mainstream discourse for for political leaders, Israeli leaders and Democrats and Republicans to use the anti-Semitism issue precisely to distract from Israel's genocide in Gaza. We've seen media discourse is incessantly asking whether Jewish students on campuses feel safe while Palestinian students in Gaza no longer have a campus, because all the universities have been destroyed. And, it's maddening to live in a world where this topic can dominate while Gaza is being absolutely flattened. And so I do think we have to use our positionality when we are called upon as Jews, who see the horrors of what's going on in Gaza to speak about anti-Semitism, to both address it and clear up misconceptions, and always bring attention back, not because anti-Semitism isn't worth isn't worth dealing with, but to always bring attention back to the genocide and to the need for it to stop. And part of that is resisting the insane conflation that can happen. And so, yeah, it's both and doing that while taking anti-Semitism seriously as a phenomenon in itself, it can be a tricky tightrope, but I think we have to hold both. Yeah.
Great. Shannon, Ben, thank you so much. I highly recommend everyone get Safety Through Solidarity. It's a great book, and will be very helpful in having the kinds of conversations that you were just talking about, Ben, of being able to hold both of these things at the same time. Um, Next month, we're going to be talking with Shoshana Brown from the Diaspora Alliance. She's also a Kohenet, so we might get a little Kohenet action in there too. But the goal is to continue addressing the way that the issues of accusations of anti-Semitism, definitions of anti-Semitism are continuing to play out today in ways that I think are really disturbing and often confusing for folks. Thank you so much, Shane and Ben, for bringing your brilliant minds to us this evening. I'm really grateful.
Thanks for having us. I know we're both
Yeah.
really excited to be a part of it with you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Andy, and thanks everyone.
Thanks. Have a good night, everyone.